Charity McDowell, and I am a reporter with Sports Equity Lab. And I recently graduated from Stanford University with my master's in community health and prevention research, where I also got to play volleyball and had the honor of doing that. And today we are going to be having a conversation about the relationship between the sports environment and the well-being and performance of athletes. To set the stage a little bit, August 10th, 2025 was the one-year anniversary of the U.S. men's basketball Olympic gold medal match in Paris. And within that game, the audience was electric. The environment was awesome, and they won the game, and it was a great time. You have a week after that, media is blowing up about spectators throwing out sex toys onto the WNBA courts. Obviously, this calls for great attention, that there are very different environments that these athletes are being asked to perform in. And it makes us raise the question of how does that impact the athlete beyond the court, within the court, their well-being, their performance, all of it. And because of that, our lab has conducted research called the 2024 Olympic Consensus on Violence and Safeguarding to explore just that, explore how does this sports environment impact the athletes. And there were three specific aspects to the environment that we wanted to focus on: spectators' behavior, media, and economic factors. And within that research, that's what we looked on. And today, within this interview, that's exactly what we're going to discuss. So I'm so happy to have Ron with me, Ron Kroichick. And he is going to introduce himself. He is a sports journalist with the SF Chronicle, and it is so exciting to have you here as a part of the conversation. Please, Ron, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Charity. I appreciate it. Yeah, my name is Ron Kroichick. I'm a reporter, sports enterprise reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. Just hit my 30-year mark at the Chronicle, so I can barely remember my college days, like as Charity is in the middle of. And included in my my work for the Chronicle is covering a lot of Warriors. And last summer, I had the privilege of traveling to France to cover the Olympics, mostly because of Steph Curry, who is a rather popular athlete here in the Bay Area. One of the few who drives digital traffic for us at sfchronicle.com. So in addition to Ann Killian, who normally covers the Olympics, the Chronicle sent me mostly to cover basketball. So I was there covering men's and women's basketball. The women also had a Bay Area presence with Sabrina Ionescu, who grew up here in the Bay. But most of my time was following Steph Curry and the men's team and covering him, which was an interesting Olympics. Started out slowly for Steph and then finished with a flourish, as most people remember. And I've also been involved to some extent with the Valkyries and WNBA this summer. So I have some sense of what Charity was talking about and the contrast and the larger issue of how athletes perform their best and how environmental factors influence that. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and as you just said, like, you have been in both of these environments. Like, you were at the U.S. Olympics, you have been at the WNBA games. And so I want to hear from your perspective with being at both of these environments. What do you believe spectators and fans need to know about how their behavior impacts athletes?
Well, I think the first thing is to remember that these athletes are people. I think it's easy to forget because you're watching on TV and you see them perform on this stage and it's like almost like a show. And you forget that they're people with kids and lives and parents. And, I remind my dad, who's a big sports fan, in his 80s. And, it's easy to forget, I think, sometimes. And the other thing I think is how it's more than just what they're seeing in the basketball game, for example. There's the culture and the atmosphere and the tone around the team. And I'll focus a lot on Steph Curry because I've covered him a lot and I know him pretty well. And I think the Warriors' success beyond the basketball skill traces to the culture that Steph Curry and Steve Kerr have created. And it's a culture of inclusiveness and interaction and collaboration. And Steph Curry is a global superstar, global celebrity. He doesn't have to interact with the rookies on the roster the way he does. He's a genuinely engaging person. He certainly doesn't have to respond to pesky reporters like me when I reach out to arrange an interview. But I've known him for years. He treats me very respectfully. We have that connection. That's how he treats everybody. It's really how he conducts himself. And I think that's a big factor in the Warriors' success and in his success. The other point I'll make about that is sort of the connection among teammates, right? And I have kind of a personal story on this front. is Steph struggled his first 4 games in France. He wasn't making shots. That's obviously what he does. And my job was to write about him and write about what's happening. And in Lille, France, after the 3rd game, the Puerto Rico game, we were talking about what's going wrong. Why aren't you making shots? And he had made his first 2 that game. And I asked him, did you feel like a flurry was coming? Because he tends to turn it around pretty quickly. And he looked at me and he said, Ron, I know a flurry is coming. And just at that moment, LeBron James walked past. And without breaking stride, he turns back, looks at both of us, and says, damn right it is, and kept walking. And Steph and I both laughed, and I obviously, that was perfect for my story. But Steph later, 2 games later, goes nuts, scores 36 against Serbia, has the great gold medal game against France. And then it was actually on the Stephen Colbert show not that long after, and he told that story of talking to a reporter from the Bay Area, who was me, and LeBron walking past, and sort of that little quote, damn right it is, was reflective of the faith he had in Steph, right? And also sort of the urgency, like this is the Olympics, we need you. But Steph he told Colbert that, how he got through that was a lot of positive self-talk. Even as someone of his stature, you have to remind yourself, I can do this, I'm good, I put in the work. He often says, trust the work. And Steph works very hard, and he figures at some point that's going to show. It's not easy, even for Steph Curry, but at some point that work is going to show in his performance, and ultimately it did.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Like, that's really cool. That's really cool that like you got to be there for like all of it. And,
well, it was sort of surreal because it's the Olympics. I mean, usually it's 20 people around athletes, but because the group play was in Lille, which is about 200 miles away from Paris, there weren't as many reporters there. And the first 2 games, there was a small group around Steph. But the 3rd game, it was me and one reporter from Japan who asked Steph 1 or 2 questions and then left. So I had like 4 or 5 questions, just me and Steph. And Steph's fine. Steph's comfortable with that because he knows me, right? There's a history. And it wasn't antagonistic, like, why aren't you making shots? It was trying to get into his mindset, and is he frustrated, and how is he going to get out of it? And the timing was just hysterical with LeBron walking by, and of all the players on the team, the only one sort of other than LeBron and KD is like the only ones at his level. And then what made it even a relevant story is 2 days later, Steph absolutely got on a flurry, one of the all-time flurries actually.
That's beautiful, and it's cool to hear too. Like it's like that mental game that you have with yourself that a lot of athletes have to have, but then it's like you kind of have to learn how to be resilient within different environments and different spaces, like regardless of what the environment looks like.
I mean, I don't know how you are in volleyball or working on your academics, but you have good days and you have bad days, right? I mean, I write some stories that flow better than others. Some I think are really impactful. Others are probably mediocre. But when Steph has, when a pro athlete has an off night, it's there for everybody to see. Right? You can call up the box score on your phone. And I think that's what fans tend to forget, is that they have good days and bad days, just like all of us, but their good days and bad days are out on public display. And it takes a certain fortitude, a certain resilience to fight through that and to accept that. It's okay to have a bad day. That's human. That's being human. And Steph obviously fought through it and then had an extraordinary final 2 games in the Olympics and really sort of saved the U.S. team and won the gold medal.
Would you say there are any other environmental conditions that allow athletes to truly perform at their best?
I would point out the coaching and how the tone the coach sets. And again, I'm going to keep this focused a lot on the Warriors because that's what I'm very familiar with. But Steve Kerr is one of the best sports figures I've ever dealt with in terms of his people skills, his intelligence beyond sports. It's not just about basketball. I mean, he just understands people. He understands the world. He understands how to bring together a disparate group of people, right? It's not, you have Steph Curry at one end, but you have, different kinds of personalities and athletes. And I think the tone he sets both for the Warriors and then for the Olympic team. He was obviously the Olympic team head coach. And he wasn't badgering Steph, why aren't you making shots? He understands how hard Steph works. So I think, and that was a unique assignment for Steve Kerr, because he has all the best players in the world. I mean, he has an incredibly talented team, and anything less than the gold medal, as he said, would have been a failure. That's a certain unique pressure that a coach has to deal with. But I think that's a big factor on how athletes perform. Absolutely, they feed off their coach. If their coach is constantly, criticizing them or ripping them publicly, it's harder to perform. I mean, again, they're human. So I think the way, the tone, the collaboration Steve Kerr sets, I think, has been a big factor in the Warriors' success and in the Olympic team's success last year.
I completely agree with you. I've seen the same thing in my experience as well. Like having a stable coach, regardless of the circumstance. Like you look at them, like even just looking at them and like seeing that their face hasn't changed, like that in and of itself is like, okay, everything is okay. You know what I mean? Like it's like, I completely agree with what you're saying. I completely agree.
And in Kerr's case, there's also the credibility of having won, 5 NBA championships as a player. I think that carries weight. And so when he explains something, it's coming from a place of personal knowledge and personal history. And he's also doing it in a way that's not demeaning or offensive. He just has a real good sense of messaging, I think.
So let's shift to media, your specialty. I want to know, what can the media do to represent athletes more humanely and more holistically?
That's a great question. And I will start my answer by saying I'm fortunate. I was a beat writer in my younger days. I covered the Oakland A's for 5 years, the Oakland Raiders for 4. But for the last 25 years, pretty much, I've been a feature writer at the Chronicle. My title now is Sports Enterprise Reporter. But what that means is trying to find deeper, more in-depth stories on athletes and trends. My favorite stories are profiles and stories that illuminate something about an athlete that fans might not know. I'm fortunate that my assignment is to find those stories and not necessarily to write. I don't really write about games very often, the Olympics being an obvious and welcome exception. But I do a lot of features, and I do a lot of Warriors-related features. And 2 examples to your question that I think come to mind is I've done a ton of enterprise on Steph Curry. I mean, because beyond his skills, he's such an engaging personality, and he's so popular here in the Bay. But he also does things people don't always see. And probably 5-7 years ago, maybe, I did a story on how often he meets with terminally ill children. And it was kind of depressing in some ways, but I think powerful, that he fields tons of requests from terminally ill children, Make-A-Wish Foundation, things of that nature. And he does, he can't do all of them, but he does quite a few. So he and I talked at length about how this affects him. He has kids, and the kids were younger at that time. What the impact of these interactions are like for him, and what he senses the impact are for the kids. And this is Steph didn't grow up as a prodigy. I mean, he was, underrated. He was small. He was not expected to be an NBA superstar by any means. So he's still kind of adjusting to this impact he has on other people. But I think it was a really powerful story, and I think it showed, to your point, sort of another side of Steph, right? Of the holistic. We're not just talking about dribbling and shooting. We're talking about how he interacts with other people. And the other example that comes to mind right away is last fall, I went to Los Angeles and spent a day with Ann Kerr, who's Steve Kerr's mom, who is still teaching at UCLA at age 90, which is pretty impressive and inspiring at age 90. And she's had a remarkable life. I don't know how much of your viewers here know, but Steve's dad was the president of American University in Beirut and was assassinated in 1984 when Steve was a freshman at the University of Arizona. So Ann Kerr, had this unspeakable tragedy to get through in midlife. She was, I believe, 49 at the time, and kind of had to rebuild her life. And, she shared a passion for the Mideast with Mr. Kerr. That's where they met. So my story got into sort of her life's journey and how she rebuilt her life, how she taught at the American University of Cairo in Egypt, and then came back to LA and worked at UCLA the last 30 years. And part of what made that relevant was it helped explain Steve Kerr's political engagement. Because, he spoke at the Democratic Convention last year in support of Kamala Harris. He's been very outspoken on gun safety issues and other political hot button issues that sports figures often avoid. So the story, in addition to telling the tale of Ann Kerr's journey, my attempt was to explain how Steve became the way he is. He grew up with two very politically minded parents, who his dad taught at UCLA. His mom I don't believe she taught at UCLA at the time, but she was very involved in the international world. They lived part of his childhood in the Middle East. He was born in Beirut, and how that shaped him and how that helps explain who he is now. And again, to your point and your question, I think the media, and again, I'm fortunate that I have the time to explore these kinds of stories, because a lot of writers, reporters, their job is to cover the games. But in addition to that, if you can tell these kinds of stories, I think you give a fuller portrait of the athletes and the coaches. And hopefully readers get a fuller understanding of the people involved, and that might shape their behavior or their view of the athletes.
That is beautifully said. Beautifully said. I couldn't agree more. So we're going to shift again. Economic stability. How do you see the connection between an athlete's economic empowerment or financial security and their overall well-being?
No, it's a good question, because as engaging and impressive as Steph Curry is, he's about as financially stable as you can be between his salary and his endorsements, and he's off the charts, as he should be. He's earned it. But the flip side of that, as we've seen, is the WNBA, right? And that league is soaring in popularity, and yet the athletes are not getting really their fair share of the pie. And that's been an ongoing news story this season. And I haven't covered it closely, but we've had reporters who do, and I've written some about the WNBA. But it's an interesting dynamic because, the WNBA is not new. It's not a startup. It's 25 years old. But the growth is just taking off, fueled by Caitlin Clark, obviously, and also some other really, dynamic athletes. And the popularity is there. I mean, look at the Valkyries. The Bay Area's team has sold out every game this year at Chase Center, which I don't think anyone saw that coming. I think people knew women's basketball, and mostly because of Stanford's success with Tara Vanderveer. Women's basketball was a good market for women's basketball. But to sell out right off the bat and to have the success the team is having and to interact and engage with the community the way it has is remarkable. I did a story on just the business side of it and how the Valkyries really connected with their fan base even before they played a game, through public outreach, and they chose the right colors, and they, peddled the merchandise, and it's been a really interesting story. But to your point, yeah, I think economic well-being is part of this. And the issue I would like to raise here is gambling, because that's become, you hear often now about how athletes are getting hassled online, not just professional athletes, college athletes. And you probably have experienced this or know someone who's experienced this yourself, because a gambler lost a bet. Now it's not just the outcome of games, but there's prop bets. On major league pitchers and whether they're going to throw a strike or a ball on the first pitch. I'm not a gambler, so I don't quite understand I do understand it's all money driven, obviously, but I'm not compelled to bet the way a lot of people are. But the sad thing is a lot of those people who bet are now, because of social media and because of the digital world, have direct access to athletes and are harassing them. And to your point, and to the larger point, you're trying to address at this symposium, that's a serious issue. And that, again, these athletes are human, and that affects their mental well-being. It affects how they perform, no question. And it's just not right. I mean, if you're going to gamble, I guess that's it's legal in most states. Go ahead, but it's just not appropriate to harass and abuse athletes involved. And I think there's been more and more stories coming out in the last year or two about that dynamic, and unfortunately, I think it's only going to get more problematic, and it'll be interesting to see how it's resolved. And the teams and the leagues who always shunned these associations with gambling have now embraced them because of the money it brings in. And that's an obvious conflict and an obvious problem. A lot of these franchises and leagues on one hand are saying, don't hassle our athletes. And the other hand saying, keep gambling because it's bringing in money. So that's a contradiction that's going to have to be addressed at some point.
And that's the interesting thing between like the business of sports and like actually enjoying the sport. Like I've noticed that like just as athletes become like more and more successful or they reach new levels, it's like you kind of go from loving it and like really just like playing the game to, in a way, like as you get to like pro level, it's like, oh, it's a business, and which is really sad to see.
Right. Well, I mean, and the reality is, and I've written a lot about this. I just have a story coming out next week. It's a business. It's an open business now in college. I mean, with revenue sharing and NIL, and you can probably speak to this better than I, but I always used to be very careful about how I wrote about high school or college athletes compared to pro athletes, because pro athletes is their job. They've chosen to do this. Steph Curry's making tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. If he does something worthy of criticism, he doesn't do it often, but if he does, it's my job to criticize him because he's a professional athlete. He's out there, right? I think it's different for high school and college athletes. They're kids. But now college athletes is becoming a little bit of a gray area because, there's an offensive tackle who just signed with Texas Tech for $5 million over 3 years. So now he's essentially a professional athlete in college, but he's 17 years old. So how do you cover that as a journalist? How do you write about him? I think you probably write about him or think about him a little differently than you did 10, 15 years ago. I mean, he's chosen to make money. He's still not an NFL player, so it's probably not the same dynamic. But to your point, I think the business and the purity of sports are the business is taking over. That's just the reality. And I do think college athletes deserve a share of the revenue. I mean, college football players generate billions of dollars, literally, for their universities. Absolutely, they should get a portion of that. I don't know that the current system is the best. I mean, I think that's still working itself out. How do you pay football players compared to basketball players compared to volleyball players, right? I mean, there needs to be some connection to the revenue those sports generate, but at the same time, you can't leave the Olympic sports in the dust. I mean, you've got to find some sort of equity and fairness. So I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that college sports have always been big business, and now it's becoming just more forthright about it, I guess.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to hear from your point of view as well. Because like I said, like I have the experience from like college, but like hearing it from the journalist point of view, like how NIL and all these things are impacting like that world as well. Like it's impacting everything. So
right. Well, it's a seismic shift, right? I mean, we're seeing things that never been the case before. I mean, it's remarkable, and it'll be fascinating to see how it evolves because it's obviously in its infancy right now, the whole process. So how it looks now and how it looks in 10 years is going to be much different, probably.
Last question for you, Ron. If you could tell spectators, media professionals, and sports leaders one thing they should do to help create positive change in sport, what would it be?
I'd probably go back to the earlier point about, I mean, it sounds sort of trite, but, remember that athletes are human beings with families. I think this comes up sometimes when, a player, like a Major League Baseball player, might miss a big game because he's on paternity leave. And the fans of the team are like, wait a second, this game is going to affect the playoffs. And they forget that, like, well, maybe he just had his first kid, and I guess that's the point I would probably suggest is, you can be more than one thing, right? I mean, you're a student and an athlete. I'm a journalist and a dad and a son. We all have different, this isn't unique to you or me, we all have different roles in our life. And it's easy for fans just to think of Steph Curry as the point guard for the Warriors. But he's also a father to 4 kids, and he's a husband, and he's a son, and he's a businessman, right? I mean, he runs an empire, basically. And yes, the main thing, keep the main thing, right? I mean, his main job is playing basketball for the Warriors. But if he has to miss a game for a family issue, that should be okay. That shouldn't be for us to judge. That's his life. And I guess the example there would be Andrew Wiggins of the Warriors missed a month or two of a recent season for a personal matter. Despite journalists' attempts, we never found out what it was. There was a lot of speculation it was involving his dad, who subsequently passed away. But at some level, it's our job to try to, when a player misses that much time, it's a fair question why. But at the same time, ultimately, it's his prerogative. Or if the team approved, the Warriors obviously approved it, and he was out. And that's, whether it was needing to be a son in his father's final days or whatever it was. Again, I just think the larger question or larger point is these athletes are also people, and that means they have other things going on in their lives. And it's fair. I mean, they've chosen a public life, so that's part of the price. But I do think fans and media need to have some empathy and be just sort of aware of that. And it's so easy to become caught up in the game of it, right? And it's just, because it's a competition. It's a high-level competition. And that's what captivates us. It's watching Steph Curry finish off the Olympics the way he did is so memorable and so impactful to fans. I mean, it was for me. I've been in the business for almost 40 years now, 37 years, I think, and 38 years actually. And that was one of my top 5 events I've ever covered, obviously, to see the Olympics the way that unfolded. And that's what moves us. That's what keeps bringing us back. And that's all good as long as you balance it with some acknowledgement of that there's still people with lives and problems and everything we've got.
That's beautifully said. Thank you so much, Ron, for your time, for your narrative, for sharing your perspective. It's really valuable. It's really appreciative. It's exciting to see how media will shift, how everything will shift over the coming years. And hopefully we continue to see through research and also through our own experiences that creating a safe environment for the athlete is up to all of us. It's all of our jobs. And there's a lot to be done within that, but it's really exciting to hear reporters like you making the effort to help people see these athletes holistically, because you're right, they're more than human. So again, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at Stanford in the October event coming up here soon. Thanks so much, Ron.
Great. Thanks for having me, Charity. Enjoyed the conversation.